I was furious. I drove to the house of my wife's lover to confront him. When he saw me, he turned pale and tried to close the door, but I forced it open. What I saw inside was a nightmare. It made me punch him and call the police in complete shock. The first crack in my seemingly perfect life appeared on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Helena, my wife of 11 years, walked into our Prague apartment. Her cheeks were rosy from the cold, and her perfume filled the air. She greeted me with a brief kiss, but her eyes quickly went to her phone, which buzzed loudly in her coat pocket. At first, I thought nothing of it. Helena worked as an event planner for the city's elite, and her job often involved unpredictable hours and demanding clients. She thrived in chaos, and her energy was contagious. But lately, that energy had felt distant, like she was living a life I wasn't part of. It was the little things that started to bother me. The late-night showers, the whispered phone calls, and the new lingerie I had never seen her wear at home. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. After all, I, too, had long hours as an architect, leaving me little time to wonder about such matters. But then, I found the bracelet. I discovered it while searching the glove compartment of her car for parking receipts. A delicate gold chain, neatly tucked in a velvet box, with a tiny heart-shaped charm. At first, I thought it was a gift for me, a surprise for our upcoming anniversary. But when the day passed and the bracelet never appeared, my heart sank. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that followed, growing stronger every day. Helena's behavior didn't help. She started leaving for work earlier and returning later. Her phone, once casually left on the counter, was now always in her hand or hidden away. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She grabbed it so quickly that it startled me. "It's work," she said, her eyes briefly meeting mine before turning back to the screen. But her hand trembled slightly, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was terribly wrong. The turning point came on a Thursday night. Helena was in the shower, and her phone was charging on the nightstand. I hesitated, my conscience wrestling with my growing suspicions. But when the screen lit up with a message preview, my heart stopped. "Miss you already, gorgeous. Friday can't come soon enough. Martin." The name sounded familiar. Martin, a wealthy client Helena had mentioned before. "He's exhausting," she'd said with a laugh, but the tone of this message was different, intimate. My hands shook as I put the phone back. When the shower turned off, I quickly stepped into the kitchen, pretending to be busy. Helena appeared shortly after, her hair wrapped in a towel. I greeted her casually, trying to hide the tension in my voice, but she didn't seem to notice. Over the next few days, I pieced together the clues. Martin Sakura, a flashy entrepreneur known for his lavish parties, seemed to be exactly the type of client who would demand Helena's attention. But the messages suggested something far more than a professional relationship. I decided to follow her on Friday evening. Helena was dressed impeccably in a sleek black dress, heels that accentuated her long legs, and a touch of red lipstick. "Client dinner," she said, avoiding my gaze as she kissed me goodbye. Once she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her through Prague's cobblestone streets. My focus was entirely on her silver car ahead of me. She pulled into the driveway of a large villa on the outskirts of the city. The house, all glass and steel, stood against the night sky, a monument to excess. I parked at a distance, watching as she walked to the door. Martin greeted her with a grin, his hand lingering on her back as he guided her inside. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, my mind spinning with anger and disbelief. Finally, I decided this wasn't over. I needed answers, no matter the cost. The next evening, I found myself standing at Martin's front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I rang the doorbell, the chime echoing in the cold night air. My mind replayed 100 possible scenarios, confronting him, demanding the truth, or simply unleashing my fury. After a few moments, the door opened. Martin stood there, casually dressed with a glass of wine in hand. But when he saw me, his confident demeanor faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. "Victor," he said, his voice tense, "what are you doing here?" "You know exactly why I'm here," I said, stepping closer. "Where is Helena?" "She's not here," Martin quickly replied, his voice rising slightly. "You're mistaken." "Mistaken?" I took another step forward, forcing him to back away. "I followed her here last night, Martin. Don't lie to me." He tried to shut the door, but I slammed my foot against it, forcing it open with all my strength. I stepped inside. Martin stumbled back, his composure crumbling. "You need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "You don't understand," I shot back. "Then make me understand." I pushed past him, heading for a door at the end of the hallway that he seemed desperate to keep hidden. His eyes darted to it, betraying his fear. I reached the door and shoved it open, revealing a room dimly lit and heavy with tension. The air smelled faintly of sweat and stale cologne. Helena sat in the corner, her arms tied behind her back, her mouth gagged. Tears streaked her face, her makeup smudged, her dress, what had been her client dinner dress, was now torn and wrinkled. Her eyes widened with a flicker of relief as she saw me. "Helena!" I rushed to her, my hands shaking as I tried to untie the knots around her wrists. "What's going on?" She whimpered through the gag, shaking her head as though trying to warn me. Before I could process it, I felt a shadow behind me. Martin lunged at me, a heavy candlestick raised high. I spun around just in time to block the blow. The force of it jolted through my arm, but adrenaline kicked in. We struggled, his movements frantic and erratic. "You shouldn't have come here," he growled. I managed to shove him off, grabbing the candlestick from his grip. My chest heaved with anger and disbelief. "What did you do to her?" I demanded. "She wanted this," he spat, crawling backward. "She came to me willingly." "Liar!" Helena's muffled scream cut through my anger, reigniting my fury. Martin tried to run, but I swung the candlestick, knocking him to the ground. He crumpled, groaning in pain. I turned back to Helena, untying the ropes with a mix of urgency and rage. When the gag fell away, she gasped for air. "He was blackmailing me," she whispered. She choked out the words, her voice hoarse. "He said he'd ruin my career, our lives, if I didn't come here." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. The betrayal I had imagined was nothing compared to the reality. Martin wasn't just her lover. He was her tormentor. And now, he lay unconscious on the floor of his own gilded cage. Helena clung to me as I dialed the police. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what had just happened. The operator's calm voice guided me through the steps, though the rage in my chest threatened to overwhelm me. The officers arrived within minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Helena's statement came out in fragments. Martin's threats, the coercion, the night she spent trapped in his twisted games, the hidden cameras, the photos he had taken without her consent, and a cache of incriminating messages that provided undeniable evidence. Martin regained consciousness as the police secured the scene. His face was pale, his arrogance shattered. When the officers cuffed him, he sneered at me. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you're dealing with." "No," I said coldly, stepping closer. "You have no idea who you've messed with." The officers led him away, and for the first time that night, the house felt quiet. Helena sat on the edge of the couch, her face buried in her hands. I knelt beside her, unsure of what to say. The woman I thought had betrayed me was, in fact, a victim, ensnared in a nightmare neither of us had seen coming. In the days that followed, the truth about Martin spread like wildfire. His arrest made headlines, exposing not only his crimes against Helena, but also a web of other victims who came forward with similar stories. He had used his wealth and influence to manipulate and exploit women, leaving a trail of shattered lives behind him. Helena faced the fallout with quiet resilience. She resigned from her job, unwilling to endure the whispers and stares of her colleagues. Therapy became her lifeline, a way to process the trauma and rebuild her sense of self. Our marriage, however, hung by a thread. One evening, as we sat on the balcony overlooking the city, she broke the silence. "Victor," she began, her voice trembling, "I know I failed you. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I was so scared." I looked at her, the woman I had loved and doubted in equal measure. "You didn't fail me," I said after a long pause. "You were trapped. But trust takes time to rebuild." She nodded, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "I'll do whatever it takes." In the weeks that followed, we took small steps toward healing. But something had changed in me. The anger that once consumed me had transformed into a steely determination. Not just to rebuild our lives, but to ensure that Martin faced every consequence of his actions. Months later, I stood outside Martin's villa. The property that once symbolized his arrogance now stood vacant. The grass had grown wild, and the polished windows were streaked with dust. His empire had crumbled, his assets seized, and his name dragged through the mud. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But revenge is a peculiar thing. It doesn't fill the void left by betrayal or erase the scars of pain. As I stared at the abandoned house, I realized that my victory wasn't in Martin's downfall. It was in reclaiming my life. Helena and I eventually parted ways, not out of bitterness, but because we both needed space to heal fully. She moved to a quiet town by the coast, dedicating her time to helping other survivors of coercion and abuse. I stayed in Prague, channeling my energy into my work and rediscovering the passion that had once defined me. One evening, I found myself walking along the Vltava River. The city lights shimmered on the water. The path felt like a distant echo, a chapter closed but not forgotten. I thought about Helena, about the love we shared and the trials we endured. And then I let it all go, the way the river carries away fallen leaves. As the breeze rustled the trees, I whispered to myself, true justice isn't about revenge. It's about finding peace. With that, I turned and walked away, ready to embrace the next chapter of my life.